Good afternoon, everybody. It's very weird for me to speak in a microphone because you can usually hear me without it. Anyway, I would like to thank everybody for coming today to the Holocaust Center. I'm curious to know, of those of you sitting here, who's here for the very first time? Could you raise your hand? Fantastic. We have a great program in store for you today, and just a little tidbit, I think we've been working on, or at least my father and I have been, oh, my name, I'm Shelley Rosen. Sorry about that. We've been working on this for about 10 years to get it in, so I'm super excited today. The Holocaust Center was founded in 1989 by a group of local survivors that were responding to Holocaust denial. They wanted to get organized, share their stories, and this history, knowing that through history, we can learn about the dangers of unchecked and normalized hatred, the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, the fragility of democracy, and the difference that each one of us can make. Over the decades, the Holocaust Center has grown and expanded, but it still stays true to its mission. We opened this museum in 2016. The museum focuses on stories and experiences of local survivors and eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. All of the artifacts you see on display have local connection, with the exception of one display of artifacts which is on loan from Auschwitz Museum in Poland. These artifacts tell a story that survivors cannot tell. These are the objects of those whose names we do not know and those who did not survive. The Holocaust Center for Humanity works with schools, teachers, students, community groups, corporations, and individuals throughout the state of Washington and the Pacific Northwest. After today's program, please take time to look around if you haven't been able to do so already. Please also check out our library and the collection of memoirs and biographies from the Holocaust. We have the largest collection in the Pacific Northwest. Now, after 10 years of waiting and preparing and a lot of work over the last couple months, I would like to introduce to you my dad, Don Rosen, who will tell you about Curt Herzstark, and his invention of the calculator. And I'm gonna show you kind of a funny little picture of me. I went into the bathroom in my parents' house one day looking for some toilet paper. And this is what I found. There are a lot of calculators in the bathroom, and my mother's collection of photographs were in the shower on bookshelves. So, you know, we're an odd bunch. Anyway, it's been really, really fun to get to spend the amount of time I've spent with my dad over the last 6 weeks and to always learn something new and be able to present this to all of you. So, Dad, it's up to you.
Oh, thank you, everybody. And Shelley, thank you for the kind introduction. I ought to read you my will more often.
I was hoping that might come up.
I want to particularly thank my son, Steve, who did some of the initial research on this, and for Shelley for all her efforts to find much of the information that we're going to look at today online. I think that over the course of her effort, she probably consumed several hundred lattes trying to do that. And I want to thank the center too for all their effort and the privilege of being here to make a presentation like this and further their cause to the awareness of the Holocaust. As many of you know, most people feel that the Holocaust was the most shameful, inhumane, and destructive occurrence of the 20th century. It was the shatter of dreams of millions of people, and we're going to talk today about just one individual who was caught up in that and how it changed his entire life. Fancy year for me. My son Steve called me about 20 years ago when I was minding my own business and said, "Dad, did you see the article in Scientific American about the Curta calculator?" He knew I was a longtime subscriber to Scientific American. And I read that, and I instantly felt a kinship with this individual because he was a mechanical engineer like I was, and he worked for a family company, and his whole life was devoted to maintaining the family business. And this story begins in Europe, and I know what some of you are thinking, who is this old guy up here? And why am I sitting here on a perfectly good Sunday learning about an old calculator? But I hope that by the end of the presentation, you might learn something new that would entertain you and stick with you. And let's hope for the best. This all takes place in a very small area of, oops. Oh, there it is. Oh, you got to hold it. Okay. This is Austria. Vienna's right in here. Liechtenstein is this little sliver of land right in here, squeezed between Switzerland and Austria. Buchenwald is up in this area. And, you know, the state of Washington is probably about that big right there. So it's a relatively small area. Curt was born to a Catholic mother and a Orthodox Jewish father who started a business in 1902, and they made mechanical calculators like this one. And he was a self-taught guy who worked for many other calculator companies before he started his own. And she was a very educated woman and was very qualified to actually run the business. And Curt started out at a very early age. There he is at 8 going with his dad to a trade show, and he would amuse the people they were trying to sell the calculators to by doing problems on the calculator. And a little kid, 8 years old, he said, "Look, it's so simple, buy one of these things." And there he is in his later years with his dad. His dad passed away in 1937. That's just before he died. What they made was calculators like this. They had hand-cranked ones. They had electric ones. And they were identical to the one you see out in the display there. That's my dad's Marchant calculator from his office. The darn thing weighs about 40 pounds. And it adds, subtracts, multiplies, and divides. That's its purpose. And that's all you could do at that time. In order to do real engineering, you had to have a slide rule. And a slide rule is a very interesting device in that not only can you do you can't add and subtract on it, but you can multiply and divide and do logarithms and sines and cosines and everything you need in engineering. You see, if you have a 1.5 there, you don't know if you're setting it at 1.5, 15, or 1500. You only know that it's 1.5, and you put the C-scale here, there. Any number you pick here, the answer's down here. So if you go 1.5 times 6, the answer is 9. And so you have to keep track yourself of the actual amount. So you don't know sometimes if the answer is 16.25 or 1,625. But slide rules were used by the millions. 40 million slide rules were used before they went out of favor. And when the electronic calculator came in, this was mine from college in the 1950s. They're made out of bamboo. This company handed me, this is a very fancy calculator. It cost $15 then. It was very high quality. And the bamboo came from the southern island of Japan, from Kyushu, from large bamboo. And they use that because unlike the original expensive ones that are made out of mahogany, this had half. Bamboo is not wood, it's grass. And it has half the coefficient of thermal expansion of wood. So if it was hot, cold, wherever, it always was accurate. And this is out on the table there, I think, and it's still slides just as good as the day it came on the market. Well, Curt worked in the factory with his dad starting at the age of 14. And he went to technical school as well. And when he went to technical school, he didn't go just to get grades. He knew he had to learn how precision mechanics functioned and how you could use it to make calculators. But every 2 weeks, his dad sent him out of the factory as a salesperson, and he went around Europe trying to sell Herzstark calculators. And starting in 1928, when he was 26 years old, all his customers said, "You've got to make a lighter calculator. We can't lug these things around anymore when we go out in the field to do accounting checks." And he heard it over and over and over. And over the years, everybody who was a calculator manufacturer was trying to do the same thing, but nobody could figure out how to do it. They made some inroads and they dropped from 35 pounds to 30, but that wasn't going to hack it. And Curt was coming back from a sales call back home, and he was on an express train and had a nice compartment all to himself. And this was in 1937, 9 years after he started thinking about how to do this. And he was in the compartment, and it came to him, and he said to himself, "Oh my God, I think I know how to do it." And his problem was, up until that time, he could figure out something like this for addition and multiplication, but he couldn't figure out subtraction and division, because in order to do that, he would have to turn the handle backwards. And to turn the handle backwards, he would have to have a big gearing system, and the gearing system would make the thing so big it was heavy again. And so it came to him how to make it small and keep cranking clockwise for both subtraction and for division. And I'm going to tell you about what came to his mind to make this happen in just a minute. But he immediately came home, and in the factory, he made this particular device right here just to prove out what his solution was. And this is not small like a Curta calculator, it's somewhat bigger, but it did work. And he made also some working parts of it just to make sure that it would work. And he did get a patent for it in 1938. Even his own expert workman at the factory told him he was nuts and it would never work. But it did work. And so he had plans now to fulfill his dad's dreams. His dad died the year before and never knew he had discovered the secret of this. And all of a sudden, his plans to make this in the Herzstark factory and have a monopoly on it and make it a great big company, the Holocaust shattered his dreams as well. And Hitler decided to come into Austria in the annexation. And when he came in, not much happened at first to the Herzstark company, but after a month, army people showed up at his front door, and they were on a mission to search Austria for all manufacturing facilities and try and convert them into making armaments for the war. And his factory was selected to make precision measuring gauges that were used in the manufacturing of the Panzer tanks and other armaments. They interviewed him, and even though he was half Jewish, they cast a blind eye at that because his mother, who was Aryan, owned the company, and they didn't want to mess with it. They let the company be just as it is. They just said, make this instead of calculators. And this is a picture of Curt during that time when, with his father passed away, he was running the whole show. And what happened was everything went along just fine till about 1943, and a couple of his workers decided that they were going to listen to the BBC and get news of how the Allies were coming along. And they typed up the news and made leaflets and distributed to all their friends in the underground and so forth. And somehow the Gestapo got wind of it, tracked down the typewriter it came from, and they arrested 2 of his workers and took him to the prison in Vienna. And he went down there to get them out, and they said, we got to have these guys back. They're critical to our production of our measuring gauges you need. But they wouldn't listen to him, and they sent him away. And about a week later, they called him up and said, well, come on back down here, maybe we can talk about this. And they imprisoned him. And they had a bunch of trumped up charges, like he had sent a check to a Jewish friend, and that was against the rules to do that. And they took one of the workers and beheaded him, and they sent the other to a concentration camp. And that second person actually survived that concentration camp and lived. But Curt stuck in the prison in Vienna, and he's in there for a couple of weeks, and they said, we're going to transfer you to another prison, and they send him via Linz here, where he was in prison for a day, and he got to Prague and put in the infamous Pankrat prison in early October, and this was a place built in 1899. It was a huge prison, but now the SS had taken it over, and they used it fundamentally as a holding place for prisoners before they decided where they were going to get rid of them. And the poor prisoners that were in there were, for the SS, they were just people to play with. They were just so cruel. It was just awful. That's what they, whoops, that's what they called the, oops. Where was I? Oh, there it was. That's what they call the axe room. You see there's a guillotine there, and there's multiple hanging stations where they can hang people, several at a time. And they had all kinds of rules in there. You broke them, that's where you ended up. And finally, at the end of October, they said, off to Buchenwald with you. And he arrived there in the 29th of October. And when you arrive at Buchenwald, you see the main gate here. And there's the main gate right there. And when you go through there and it shuts behind you, you read this. A lot of concentration camps had this out in the front, and Buchenwald, you could only see it from the inside. And it says, to each his own. The SS interpret that to mean to each what he deserves. And this was a terrible place to be. When you came in, all your stuff was taken away, and you were issued wooden clogs, a canvas pants, a canvas shirt, and a hat, no underwear, no underclothes. That was it. And it was fairly lightweight. And it wasn't the coldest concentration camp, but it was plenty cold in the winter. It was 30 degrees out. And the barracks are here. You can see the roll call area right here where they're standing. And all of a sudden, can you imagine a few weeks earlier, you were in Vienna in your factory, running your factory, and you're getting up in your apartment and having breakfast. Now you're standing here in the roll call line. Whoops, let me get right to there. And this is the card they issued you. There's Curt, what he looked like when he was imprisoned. When you look at it, you can see how detailed the Nazis were. They kept records on everything. All this here is all about what his face, nose, and ears look like, and where he is from, Vienna. Here's a Mischling. He's half Jewish. And you can see some of these out in the table there if you want to take a close look at them. This is the layout of the camp. This is the main gate right here, and this is the roll call area right in here. This is the big factory that was associated with the camp. 13 buildings built by the slave laborers at Buchenwald. They held 3,500 workers in there that were all slave labor workers. They made parts for the V-2 rockets and other things. They wouldn't let any Jews work in there because they were afraid of sabotage. Jewish people worked over here in the garden where they, down here where they grew, hard to see that from here, where they grew vegetables and food for the camp. And this is where Curt Herzstark was assigned when he came in, working out in the cold in November. And the I lost my train of thought here. The camp had a system where all the effluent from the latrines, the kitchens, and everything kind of came downhill, and it ended up in a cesspool area. And what they used is Jews to haul this stuff out into the field and use it for fertilizer. And they had a barrel, not as big as a big barrel, but a barrel with two long rods, and one person was in front holding it, and the other was in back holding it. And the two guys would stand there, and a third person had a big ladle, and his job was to scoop up the sediment. That was the best stuff for the fertilizer. And he would scoop that stuff up and put it in the barrel, and an SS guy would stand there and make sure he filled the barrel up clear to the top so it was plenty heavy. And those poor guys would take off and try and spread it where they were directed. And it was so muddy and filthy that their clogs would get stuck in the mud, and the SS guys would just keep whipping them, and they'd going along in their bare feet, and then they'd slip and the barrel would turn over, and there were watering hydrants out there, and they'd turn the water, the freezing cold water on them and get them all cleaned up. And now they had to continue working their 11-hour shift, and they had to go back, you know, to get another load. And many of them died from pneumonia from that kind of treatment within a week. But the average life of a person working in that area was about 3 months. But they didn't care because more were coming. And the idea was anyway to get rid of them. Curt had that easy job of just standing there and ladling, and that was on purpose. They didn't want to kill him. They just wanted to soften him up a little bit. And he was standing at roll call one morning, and he was told to report to the commandant's office, and he said to himself, uh-oh. And he went there, and this SS guy in his polished boots said, oh, I've got your dossier here, and I see that you're an experienced precision mechanic, and you know all about this kind of thing. I want you to report to the director of the Gustloff factory and work in there with him and if you behave yourself and do a good job, you might live. Nice seeing you, Mr. Herzstark. And out he went. And he reported to him, and he was a very educated and very charming individual, Mr. Herzstark. You know, he was not only an engineer, but when he was 5 years old, his dad and mom had given him piano lessons and violin lessons. And by the time he was a teenager, he was an accomplished pianist and violinist. And he starting when he was 27 years old, had a grand piano in his apartment. But he was a very charming guy, and he got along very well with the superintendent of this plant. And after a while, this superintendent took him aside and said, I've gotten your dossier from the commandant, and I see you have an idea for a little miniature calculator that you've got a patent on in Vienna, because the SS knew everything about people. And he said, yes, that's true. He said, well, listen, I think that would be a good product for Germany, and if you can make us drawings of it for us to produce, we'll spare you. And we'll even give one of those to Hitler. And at this juncture, you know, these people working here, they didn't realize how the war is going. They get no news at all. And so, can you imagine, his plan was to make this calculator for his Herzstark companies. Now he's being told, well, make the drawings for us and we'll do it. But he said, this is my way out, maybe. And so they gave him pieces of paper this big, and they gave him pencil and eraser, and they gave him drafting tools. And they said, you can work on this on Sundays and in your spare time during the week, and you can make your drawings. So over a period of about 1.5 years, he made the drawings for the parts of the Curta calculator. Now, he'd already done it mostly once before, but his prototypes that I showed you a picture of earlier and all his drawings are in his desk drawer in Vienna. Now he's here and he has no reference materials. And so he has to do it out of his memory and what he knows, which is considerable. And I was just taken in by this because as a mechanical engineer who designs things as well, I said to myself, could I have done that? And the answer is clearly no way. And it was just like an explosion of the intellect or something. And he drew these drawings. This is the only 3 drawings that I can locate. The original drawings of the detailed parts that he drew by hand are in the museum in Liechtenstein. But down here you can see it says Buchen, you can't, but it says Buchenwald, 1944. And that's a pretty nice drawing for even an engineer to make, just a 3D drawing. This was, he put on here Lilliput, and he was kind of an educated guy. And I don't know if any of you remember the Gulliver's Travels by 300 years ago, it was a story about a guy who makes his way through the world, and he comes across a little island called Lilliput. And there are little people on there 6 inches high. And it was a very fanciful tale. And so he called it Lilliput. And what happened is it's getting to be the fall of '44, and the Allies are starting to bomb the hell out of the factory. And they've destroyed so many of the components of the factory and the machines that they decide they're going to take the machines they can out of there and take them up to a little town called Bilroda, which had an abandoned potash mine. And potash is potassium chloride, it's salt, essentially. And they took 500 guys on a train up there, and they were the ones that were to install and run these machines and continue the production of E2 parts. Well, this mine, you went down in the mine elevator 2,000 feet down to where the machines were. And it was freezing cold outside, but it was 70 degrees down in there. And the air was so salty that Curt, who had contracted tuberculosis down in Buchenwald, the salty air sealed up his tuberculosis areas and actually saved his life. And they came back, and it was dangerous down in there. One time when they were down in there working, the mine elevator stopped working, and they had to climb the stairs up 2,000 feet to get out. That's like climbing up 2 of the Columbia Towers. Not all the guys made it out. And in April, they came back. Now they only had 50 guys. And they walked back. And as they're walking back, other prisoners are walking from Buchenwald this way. And they're part of one of the death marches they had. You know, they're trying at the end of the war to keep moving the prisoners into safer and safer places in Germany. And they were yelling at him, hey, don't go back. You'll end up coming this way with us. But he did go back. And just as he got there, General Patton came in and freed the place. And he stayed there for a few weeks and got food and nourishment and got himself together. And he was virtually a free man, but he had his drawings, and he wanted now to somehow find venture capital and make this calculator. Well, he had been so many places during his time as a salesman. He had friends in almost every city you can see on that map that had the use for calculators. He'd been to all of them. And he was such a friendly guy. People remembered him. And he remembered them as well. And he remembered that he had a friend in Weimar. And that's only 5 miles there. So he went down to Weimar and found this guy. And he showed him this thing, and the guy was just astounded when he saw it and said, you know something? Up here close by in Samerda is the Rheinmetall factory. Now, this is a factory that made armaments, but in peacetime, like in peacetime, they made calculators. And they knew about calculators and had people that could actually make this prototype. This was actually part of Buchenwald, and they had 1,300 Jewish Hungarian women in there making armaments, and they had all gone by the time he got there because they put them on a big death march and took them away. But the Americans were in control of this area of Germany for a while, and in a few months, the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, which had given this area to the Russians, became East Germany, took effect. But he made a deal, and they went ahead and made 3 prototypes for him. And their plan was to make them as part of the Rheinhall factory, and they made him the technical director, and they gave him a driver and a place to live right nearby. And the only trouble is with the Russians, when they came, he could sense that danger was coming because some of his friends had been grabbed and taken to Crimea. And what they did is they just took them and got all the technical information they could from them and then let them be. That there was no, he sensed they were going to grab him and take him away. And so he had to make a plan to get out of there and not continue with Rheinhall. And what he did was, he was very fortunate. The Russian commandant of the area, he notified all the factories around the area, boys, we're going to have a meeting and discuss what we're going to do and what we're going to make here. And I'm calling a meeting for 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Erfurt, this little town right here. This is about 20 miles away. And when Curt heard about that meeting coming up, he made a plan to escape to Vienna. And he had friends who sewed money into his clothes and took care of him. And he left for work and then came back to his home. It was right in here. And his driver had been told to spy on him. But his driver was a great friend of his. And he told Curt, hey, they're making me tell them where you are at every minute. That's one of the reasons he made this plan. And they were patrolling right in front of his house that afternoon when he went home. And so he went out the back door, and his driver took him on the road to Erfurt, and he was afraid that the Russians were on their tail and were going to grab him. So he turned off after about 5 miles. He was a very savvy Army private, his driver, and he went across the railroad tracks in the countryside and dropped him off at Weimar, left him there, went to the meeting, acted like he was there, asking around for him and everything, and he did such a good job, other people thought he was there. But then he went back to, the driver went back to Samerda and next day reported him missing. Well, what he had done was gone down to Weimar, and they put him up in a Protestant church for the night, as they knew a bus was coming that was going to Prague, and they had gotten him a ticket. And when the bus came by the church at 10 o'clock in the morning, he hopped on, and away he went. And it took that bus 6 hours to get down into Prague. And he stayed there for a few days, and he finally got, Germans weren't allowed to ride on the trains after the war at this time. And so he got special dispensation because he was a Buchenwald guy. And he took a train down to the Austrian border, and then he walked across a bridge, across a river, which is the border between the Czech Republic and Austria, and into this little town called Gmünd. There he had another friend he had met during his calculator sales day. And he said, how am I going to get to Vienna? And he says, well, you're not getting there on the train because there aren't any passenger trains running to Vienna. And he thought about it, and after a few days, he says, you know something? Every couple of weeks, there's a coal train that comes down through here to Vienna, and they change crews right here at the border. And I know the Austrian brakeman, and he says, if you can give me some cigarettes, I think I can bribe him in some way to get you on the coal train. He did that, and he rode in the brakeman's compartment from there on the coal train, and it stopped at 2 in the morning in Vienna at the railroad station, and he walked from there to his mother's home and knocked on the door, and there she was. And in the subsequent days, he went to the factory, and he could see that the machines were all worn out, that there was no business, that the company could never be resurrected again. And he did try and get somebody nearby in Vienna to offer him seed capital so they could do a startup company and make these calculators. But nothing ever came through. And Vienna was a mess. There was 87,000 apartments had been demolished. There were 3,000 bomb craters. There was only 15 cars running around. And everything was at a standstill. And he did have some contacts in Switzerland, and he was about to make a deal with the Swiss when a telegram arrived from Liechtenstein. The Prince of Liechtenstein, Prince Franz Joseph II, the family has owned Liechtenstein for, 1,000 years or something. It's just a little place. It's about 3/4 the size of Seattle. And you can walk across it and up and down it. And he sent him a telegram inviting him to come to Liechtenstein and talk about this invention, which he had heard about through Viennese universities or their Chamber of Commerce or something. He had feelers out all over. And the reason he was looking is that at that time, Liechtenstein was a completely agricultural country. It had no industry except for one, and that was the manufacture of false teeth. And this Ivoclar company, they came to Liechtenstein in 1933, and they're still there today. They make 20% of the world's false teeth, even today. But they needed industry, and so off he went from Vienna to Liechtenstein, and he cut a deal with them. But it was a one-sided deal, because these guys in Liechtenstein they were kind of crafty, and he had no money, and he was on the short end of the stick, so to speak. They offered him a third of the company's stock, and they offered him to be the technical director. And they offered to put in so much money to get it started, which he thought was reasonable. But when they actually did it, they only put in as fourth as much. And they they split the ownership of the company up between the 8 siblings of the Franz Joseph family. And these guys didn't put their own money in. They borrowed the money from the bank. Of course, they owned the bank. And so they were so far in debt from the start, they could never create dividends to give Curt money for his shares that he owned. And all they said was, let's go. And he had to do the whole thing. He had to build the building, find the machines, find the workers, and it's just incredible to think how he could do all that, to tell you the truth. But he did it, and it's a story too long to tell how the owners put the squeeze on him and made it so he couldn't possibly benefit from this. But he put his heart and soul into it. And these are very rare pictures, by the way. This is the inside of that factory. It was completely vertically integrated. They did everything there. They're machining parts, they're assembling parts. And these parts are made within thousandths of an inch. It's like a Curta calculator is made virtually like a watch. And these are all Swiss workers. They didn't create too many jobs for the people of Liechtenstein like he hoped, because they just didn't have the qualifications. But you can see the people assembling the calculators here. Now, you think you hate your job. These people sat there all day, and to assemble a Curta calculator with 600 parts that you had to handle, they did it in teams. Somebody did the base, somebody did the mid part, somebody did the top, and they put them together, because you could not, without going nuts, take a Curta calculator from the base and assemble all 600 parts. One of the problems was that they didn't price them right. They priced them at $125. But it took 10 hours to make a Curta calculator. And with this production method, they were limited in the amount they could make, too. When they first started, they got an order from a New York department store for 10,000 Curta calculators. They had to turn it down, because there was just no way. They were only making, when they really got geared up, at about 1,000 of them a month. So the calculators were extremely controlled in their production. They only had about 1/10 of 1% rejection rate, which is like 1 out of 1,000. After all that hand assembly. And you can see one of the instructions here is that these are the, whoops, where'd I go? This is the oiling chart. There's 16 places you oil a Curta calculator, and these little codes here tell you what kind of oil to use. That's a clock oil, and that's molybdenum disulfide, which we use for heavy pressure in our business, and that's ordinary grease. and it tells you to use a small drop or a big drop, and so on and so forth. They had all these special tools they needed to assemble one. This is the first production run. This is one from the first production one. You see how it says 000968. That started with 901. So this is the 68th calculator ever made in the first few weeks of production. You can see it's different than the ones you might see out. This is out there in the case, but you can see this is different than the one in the case. It not only had the number you put in on the slider up here, but it had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 here. Well, with all these numbers, it gave people a headache. And they discontinued that after the first run of calculators. This is a very interesting calculator in that it's so darn old. And I found this in northern Italy from a person who had it, and for something that old, it had never been used. And it's in just perfect, what we call mint or museum condition. You won't find Curta calculators that old that look like that. Now, I told you I was going to tell you what happened when Curt was riding back from a sales trip in the express train. He was coming through the Black Forest and down by a Lake Constance, which is above Liechtenstein. He, on his way to Vienna, it came to him, and he remembered that this is how a desktop calculator works. Under each row of numbers, there's a long cylinder, and it's got ridges on it. And they go from short to long. And so if you press a key down at the bottom, it'll just pick up 1. But if you're, halfway up, this gear will ride over 4 of them. And up at the top, it'll pick up all 9. And this is what turns when you turn a hand crank, or you say plus and electricity turns it. 1 turn of this step drum gives you the number you've selected up on the dial that you're looking at. And if you wanted to subtract, you just turned the thing backwards. Well, he couldn't do that in his style of calculator. But what he thought of on the train, this is when that started. 1673, a guy came up with that step drum idea, and he made that calculator, who worked for every row of numbers, it had a step drum in there. But this is what he thought of on the train. And this is a method of subtraction that you can use, but you really are adding. And I'm not going to charge you for this, but let's say you wanted to subtract 29 from 46. Well, you just say 9 from 6 is 7, you carry the 1, 3 from 4 is 1, and there you go, okay? That would require him to crank it backwards. But if you use what they call the complements of 9, you say to yourself, what number can I add to 2 to get 9? And it's 7. What number can I add to 9 to get 9? It's 0. And if you had a 6, it'd be a 3. Now you take that number, and all you do is add it to your first number, and you get 116. Well, the first number is always discarded. Now you're left with 16. And the rule is, with the complements of 9, after you do this, you add a 1. Now you get 17. So there you are. Now, he has to figure out how to do this mechanically. This was used in grade schools for young people, and it's very helpful for people my age whose prefrontal cortex is shrinking, and some can't remember what the hell 9 from 6 is, and for a little kid, he looks at that and he says, well, wait a minute, 6 from 6 is 0, and 9 from, maybe it's -3, I don't know. But if you teach him this, it's quite simple, this complement of 9s. You add them up, a little kid can remember this rule real easy. And my mother's brother, when I was a teenager, he taught me this. He says, oh, hell, I never subtract. He says, I only use this. And Curt mechanically did this by inventing this curved step drum. And there's several of these out on the table there. You enter the number by positioning this to where you want it. And on this step drum, there's little cogs. Now, it's very hard to see, but you can, when this little gear right here engages by moving this thing up and down, it will pick up 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or no numbers. And you crank. Well, if you want to subtract, you lift the handle 3 millimeters, and this lower gear here gets in between those. And in between those, it's the complement. If you enter a 1, it clicks over 9 places. And it click over 2, you enter a 2, it clicks over 8 places. So you've got addition going one way and subtraction going the other way. And it's impossible to understand this without having a drawing and holding the thing in your hand and looking at it. It is so devilishly clever that you can't believe it. The only way they could make it was to take 27 stacks of little pieces of abrasion-resistant steel and stamp them out. And each one of those is only 20 thousandths of an inch thick, and they make a stack like that. You can see a drawing of those. There's the one for 1 tooth, 2 teeth. There's, I think, 8 teeth, and there's maybe 9 teeth. And I want to go back to something here. We had to, at the last step, we had to add a 1. Well, how in the world are you going to do that? Well, on one spindle, he added this upper gear. And this upper gear, when this one was going through the complement of 9, this one always picked up the last little cog over here. They're all stacked up together there. And that double thing is how he did he added the 1. He did the complements by designing a step drum, and the 1 by adding the little gear. Try thinking about that sometime. And these were made to very tight tolerances, and it took them quite a while to figure out how to make the step drum. This little guy was what you moved up and down to enter your number on the side. And you see there's a spiral groove in there. So when you move it up, that shaft turns. And when that shaft turns, it shows you what number you've picked. It rotates these numbers up here. And to make that takes this drawing. Yeah, and that's tolerance to within thousandths of an inch. Not only how deep the groove is, but where they are, and all these little indents are in exactly the right position for the ball that's in here. So when you set it, you feel kind of a little click, 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 click. And it's got this little indentation in here for the ball to sit in. So it was just a monumental engineering product. And he actually drew this sketch. It didn't look quite like this because his draftsman reproduced it. He drew this sketch in Buchenwald. And that's the complexity he was working with. This is another example I'll give you. This is a little spring that's in the Curta calculator. It's a 1/16 of an inch diameter. You can hardly see it. And it's got all these dimensions and tolerances. And they were so hung up on precision that even the markings on the bottom, they wanted the arc of the letters to be in a certain position. So they toleranced it to 50 microns, which is 2/1000ths of an inch. So talk about OCD, I don't know. Now, I personally have trouble using a Curta calculator for division. Multiplication, addition, subtraction is fairly simple, but to divide any normal sets of numbers, it takes 21 steps because you have to go till it overflows and then come back. And when you think about all the things you have to do, is you have to enter and clear, and you got to make sure that the handle is up or down and the reversing lever's up and down. And I have to take that sheet and do that one at a time. It probably takes me 21 minutes to divide. And in the field, a surveyor in the 40s and 50s and 60s, he depended on this, and they got, believe it or not, speedy at doing this. It's just a matter of practice. But the average person would not be able to follow that. And that's what limited the sales of the Curta to just surveyors, scientists, and things, and why they only made 140,000 of them. In addition to their difficulty in assembling them by hand. When they went out to sell them, they had salesman cases, demo cases. The very first one they tried was this one. They only made one. This was made very early in 1948, and it's on the counter out there. They switched from that, and they made a few of these, but they decided on this. But they only made about 26 or 27 of these for distribution and use in the whole world. There weren't very many demonstrator cases, and I'm very fortunate to have come across one, and I have one in the case out there. In 1961, a little typewriter company in Germany saw Curta having so much fun selling these miniature calculators, they decided to design one themselves. They didn't use a step drum, they used, whoops. Well, I do, shells. Oh. Right there, yeah. Thanks, Richard. And they used pinwheels. That's another way of making calculators if you don't use step drums. And you could crank this handle forwards or backwards for addition and subtraction. It does fit in your pocket a little more easily than a Curta calculator because it's so flat. Or you can hold it on its base. And there's one out there in the case you can take a look at. The trouble with it is that it's made out of rubber parts, pot metal, all kinds of things, and not nearly the tolerance of a Curta calculator. And they failed at such a rapid rate that even though they made 3,000 of them in 1961, they just couldn't take it and they closed their doors because they had as many coming back as were going out the door. It's kind of a funny thing. The same people were working there in 1970 and they said, let's try that again. And they made 1,000 of them in 1970, but then they closed it up. But Curta, the Curta company, the Cantina company, which they called it, was going broke. And so they stopped manufacturing Curta calculators in 1970, but their distribution center with all their stores had lots of calculators in them. And they were selling them clear up until 1972. But what happened was there were two guys who were Stanford students, and Bill Hewitt and David Packard. And they formed the Hewlett-Packard Company. It's called HP Inc. now. You know, they make all those printers. And Bill Hewitt wanted to make a pocket calculator, and nobody else in the company wanted to. They tried to talk him out of it many times, but he insisted. So he came out in 1972 with the HP 35 pocket calculator. It was named that because it had 35 keys on it. And it's very much like a scientific calculator today. It can do everything: sines, cosines, logs, storage, plus, minus. It ran on a battery pack. It cost $395, which would be like $2,700 today. The Curta calculator cost $125 in 1948. I don't think they ever changed the price. And that was like maybe an $1,100 machine. So it was not cheap, but even so, at that price, he sold 800,000 of them in just a couple of years. And that, of course, was the end of the mechanical calculator. And Curt Herzstark retired in 1957, only 11 years after he joined the company, because he was so much on the outs with the owners. They fired him once in the interim, and when he was fired, he went to his attorney and said, hey, I got fired. And his attorney said, well, who owns the patent? He says, well, I do. And he says, they didn't buy the patent? He says, no, they were afraid that other people would come in and try and make miniature calculators, and they didn't want the expense, the Cantina people, of fighting off these people. They wanted me to pay for any legal rebuttals to people who were trying to infringe on the patent. He said, well, just go back and tell them they can't make any more until they buy the patent from you. And that's what he did. And but even so, he just couldn't take it anymore. And he retired, and he had friends in Liechtenstein, many friends, because he was an easy guy to befriend. And he was very active with his technical friends up until the time he died. And he died when he was my age, 87, in Liechtenstein. And that's the story of the Curta calculator and how the Holocaust changed the life of an individual. And I'm very pleased to be able to present that to you today. And so if you have any questions, I'm certainly happy to try to answer them. We've run a little long. If anybody has to leave, you're certainly welcome to do so and not stay through any questions that come up. Hopefully I've done a sufficient job so there are no questions, but if there are.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be passing around the microphone. Quick note, you really got to talk into the mic, because if you talk over here, it doesn't pick anything up, so get it real close to the mouth. But
Hi, Don. I was wondering what you know about the naming process. I noticed he had his name, he seemed to be able to make sure that his name ended up on most of the versions. It would say his name and then Cortina, and when it switched to Curta, and some of the process of naming it.
Well, I'm not sure about the exact conversations he had with Cortina. I do know that when he came in there, when they first went to produce it, they looked at that name Lilliput that he had on there, and they said, that's never gonna work. And a woman on his staff said, you know, Curt, this is like your daughter. We should call it Curta. And that's how the name Curta came to be, internally from a member of the staff. And they didn't care much, the company, what he put on there. I think Herzstark is on the bottom, and Cortina's on the front. What? Oh.
It's on the back of my shirt.
Oh, it's on the back of Shelley's shirt, the bottom. Oh.
Yeah, a question. Sorry, and I apologize if we missed this. We arrived slightly late. You've talked about Curt Herzstark's work life and a little bit about the friends he made while selling, but you haven't discussed his personal life, his family. What do you know about that?
Oh, well, he was not married up until the time he came back from the concentration camp to Vienna. He was a single guy, and he had a girlfriend in Vienna. And when he went to Liechtenstein, he got a visa for her to come to Liechtenstein. And they had a son, Curt, and a daughter, Krista. And Krista just died in 2018, not too long ago. The mother, his wife was, he married a Catholic woman who came from a family who had a plumbing business. And they had property in Austria and in Vienna. And she had like no friends in Liechtenstein. And she sent, when the kids got to be about school age, like 5 years old, she sent them back to Liechtenstein to go to boarding school. And with them in boarding school, she found reasons to constantly go and check on them. And Curt went with her sometimes, but less and less frequently. And she really didn't enjoy Liechtenstein. And she finally moved back to Vienna to be with her children. And Curt didn't, even though Curt in 1957 was no longer with the company, he never wanted to go back because he knew even when he lived there, there was this simmering undercurrent of anti-Semitism. And when he visited, when he was released from the concentration camp and got back there, it was just as bad as when he left. And so he wanted to stay in Liechtenstein, and they just, I don't think he got a divorce. I think that just, they never saw each other again. His kids from Vienna never came to see him. And so he died living by himself in his flat in a little town just a mile from the factory. And he did have some great friends just across the border. And he, German folks who he knew from his days making the Curta calculators, and Christine Hollab, who's the daughter of that family, is the one who assisted in writing his autobiography. And it's published by the Ottred Society. That's a funny name, but there's a society of people who are interested. Ottred was the guy in 1614 who invented the slide rule. And so in England, and there's this Ottred Society, they deal in slide rules and calculators and things, and they produced, the German version of his autobiography was republished in English. And if you look up the Ottred Society, you can actually buy it. And it's quite a production, but he was living alone, but he had enough friends, he said, that he died with the, the satisfaction that he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do.
Yeah.
Steve?
Thank you.
My man? Oh. Oh.
Here.
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I am curious, you'd mentioned that the calculators preceding this were too big and too heavy. Can you give a sense for how much he shrunk the size?
Yes.
And how much the weight decreased relative to the previous?
Yes, the daintiest, I think, of all the mechanical calculators, which were the desktop versions, were about 30 pounds. And the first Curta calculator, the Type 1, weighed 8 ounces. It just, you could hold it in your hand. So it was quite remarkable.
Most of us who give talks of this kind are the descendants of survivors and sort of loved ones. I am amazed that a Scientific American article spawned this lifetime of interest in this person, and I just wonder if you could say, where did this curiosity come from? I mean, I know you're an engineer, but to take that article and then just make it such a commitment to better understand his life and what he created is just astounding to me. And I thank you for it, because this was fascinating.
Well, I really was taken aback by the article because I put myself in his place and I said, could I have done that? And could I have survived Buchenwald? And I think I may have lasted a day or two in Buchenwald, but that would have been it. And he overcame so many problems in camps and transportation and prisons. You know, the name Herzstark means strong of heart. And I think that probably was really true with him. And I had such admiration for his engineering skills and his ability with music and his ability to be friendly and to be a gentleman that it just fascinated me. And collecting is an interesting thing. The fun is finding these Curta calculators, which have to come from all over the world, and then trying to get them fixed, because most of them have something wrong with them. And making them all perfect was fun. And I haven't collected for about 5 years because I have about 75 calculators. And how many Curta calculators does a guy need in this world to, you know? But I would like to get them, I think, eventually maybe into museums so more people could look at them instead of being in my bathroom closet.
Dad, nice job. Being 58 years old and listening to you give this speech, it finally has crystallized for me why I'm such a disappointment to you. But my question is just, could you talk a little bit about the community of collectors, the people you have met over the years, where you send these calculators out to get fixed, how many people in the world have parts and are capable of working, where they find the calculators themselves? I think it's an interesting modern day phenomenon.
Well, for the bulk of the calculators, I was assisted by eBay because people who had them and wanted to sell them turned to eBay. One of the problems with Curta calculators now versus 20 years ago is there's hardly any more spare parts. And so if you find one and something's wrong with it, you may not be able to get it fixed. There are only about 5 people in the world that know how to take a Curta calculator apart and put it back together again. It's very complicated. There's only about, I would say, 3,000 calculators left out of the 140,000. And a lot of them met their demise when their owners were so inquisitive about how they were made that they took them apart, and they got them apart to a certain stage. And if you've ever taken apart your Model A Ford or something, you go, uh-oh. And you can't get it back together again. So I used primarily in the beginning a fellow named Jack Christensen in Illinois, and then Hans Richard in Switzerland, and my friend Romano in Italy, who's a wonderful repairman. And I've used one in Switzerland now, another one. And but I don't have anything to repair anymore, so I think that there might always be some Curta repairmen, but I'm not sure if like in the United States, there's really only one. And when he has a full-time job, and when he decides he's tired of doing it, I don't know who will do it.
Is there a master list on the internet of who owns which serial number?
You can go on the internet and type in list of Curtas, and it will show you people who have volunteered which Curta they own. There are probably another 1,000 people that own them that aren't on that list. And yes, you can look and see how many there are. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.